groundbreaking. Social stratification has been around for ages, negatively affecting millions of people around the world.
In today's edition of MNN Makers News Network, we will be discussing social stratification in modern-day India and how the now outlawed caste system has played a continuing role in poverty and education. We will have real-life stories about direct effects of stratification as told by Indian citizens themselves. Now I'll turn this over to our correspondent Ellie, who will give us more insight into the lasting effects of the caste system, which became illegal in 1950. Not that that matters because discrimination still persists, as we'll see.
Thank you, Lizzie. Well, one might assume that India's caste system would have collapsed following the creation of the Constitution in 1950. Discriminatory practices persist. Article 15 of the Constitution of India prohibits discrimination based on a variety of factors, including religion and caste. Despite the good intentions of this document, many may argue that caste discrimination is more prevalent now than ever. We see this discrimination manifest itself in a variety of ways, from generalist treatment in society to access to educational opportunities. Today, we will hear firsthand from a woman whose course of life has been dictated by her position in society. Amina works as a housekeeper in Kolkata, the capital of the West Bengal state of India. She often walks barefoot from the slum she lives in to work. Her home is noticeably cave-like, no plumbing or windows in sight. Amina is not sure of her age and has no documentation to confirm her guesses. With no personal identity, Amina is lumped in with the lower castes of India, as well as the statistics that define them. Mani Basu, an ex-CNN journalist whose family employed Amina for a number of years during her childhood, is en route with Amina to a new mall near her home. After arriving, Amina is initially rejected due to her lack of footwear, but soon a wheelchair is produced, and both her and Mani Basu enter the shopping center warily. Basu leads Amina into a Gucci store. A major reaction immediately becomes apparent as the two enter the shop. Amina is shown a Gucci bag. It's 1.25 lakhs, the clerk tells us. That's 125,000 rupees or $1,865. Basu watches Amina's face remain unchanged by this number. For Amina, this amount of money is unfathomable. Throughout the US, every shopping mall is open to the public, including expensive stores like Gucci. But in India, the majority of people are prevented from setting foot in a mall, let alone a store like that. According to Mani Basu, $1,865 is an abstract as gazillion for Indians. Few Americans can haphazardly spend money like that on a handbag, but unlike most Indians, they have the opportunity to work a reasonable number of years to save up for such a product without worry of putting food on the table. For Amina, to make enough money to pay for that purse, it would take her 25 years of labor. According to a 2017 report published by Oxfam, an international confederation of agencies fighting poverty, today, the richest 10% in India control 80% of the nation's wealth. The top 1% owns 58% of India's wealth. About 60% of India's nearly 1.3 billion people live on less than $3.10 a day, the World Bank's median poverty line. And 21% or more than 250 million people survive on less than $2 a day. This is in comparison with the United States, in which the richest 1% owns 37% of the nation's wealth.
Golly gee. And I think I spent $5 on a Sunbucks Maki Makoko this morning.
Ah, good one, Gabe. Seemingly, poverty is not the only thing affected by social stratification. To give us insight on how social class arises in the classroom, we go to Emma.
The classroom setting, littered with crayons and coloring paper, appear innocent at first glance. On a daily basis, however, many students in India continue to be subject to mistreatment based on caste by both their peers and educators. It is not uncommon for teachers to give students of lower castes poor grades based on their personal bias, or to make casteist comments that imply inferiority in the student's intelligence. Additional statistics support claims that students in lower castes suffer in India's educational system. Scheduled class comprise just 12% of scheduled tribes, 4% of the total college-going population. Literacy rates from a 2011 census reveal the possible consequences of this discrimination. In total, the scheduled castes are 10 percentage points below the national literacy rate of 74%. Historically regarded as untouchable in Indian society in the classroom, Dalit students are often targets of bullying. In a report by the International Dalit Solidarity Network, or the IDSN, there are 14 cases of violence in schools reported, and 12 of them are about sexual abuse of children from the marginalized communities. But the perpetrators are not always fellow students, as often seen in American schools.
Wowza. India is a whole world away with a whole world of problems. But did you know that social stratification is not an alien concept even to most Americans? Social stratification is in fact a global problem and affects millions, even on U.S. soil.
Gee willikers, Gabe, you were so right. The U.S. is no exception when it comes to the ills of social class and isolation.
In American culture, a feature of social stratification is a social class that is determined by occupation strongly contributing to income and wealth. Typically, upper class is determined to make an average of about $2 million per year, while lower class makes an average of only $15,000 a year. Another contributing factor is status, which is associated with prestige toward a specific occupation. Finally, power is the final factor that aids in social stratification. According to George Ritzer, power is the ability to get others to do what you want them to do, even if it's against their own will. There's quite a bit of power in this country, if I do say so myself. But whether it is being used for good is the real question. Now, over to our final correspondent who can shine a brighter light on the stratification in the modern day USA.
Proposed by Wallerstein, a capitalist society beginning in the 13th century by way of European colonizers forged a path for global stratification. Capitalism, in its roots, demands inequality because it functions under the ideology that a small group of people own a large part of the resources and a large group own a smaller part. This framework creates the motivation to move up in the world. Theoretically, everyone has the opportunity to get rich, become successful, and be happy. That is at least what so many of us have been taught to believe. Is this beginning to sound familiar? This basis is the foundation for the American dream, and in the last few years has become the cornerstone for so many problems. What we know about our current economy is that the top 1% own 40% of the United States wealth. When you subtract the remaining wealth owned by what we term the rich, this leaves 7% for the remaining population. What many of our viewers may have learned in their U.S. history classes is that the United States has a bit of a race problem. The large group of middle and lower classes, both historically and today, overwhelmingly consist of racial minorities. Like India's caste system, racial segregation has been outlawed, but that doesn't mean that it has stopped affecting factors of the country like education. According to a study done at Stanford University in 2014, only 41% of Black families and 45% of Hispanic families live in owner-occupied housing. White families, however, range at 71%. One major problem with this is that by being forced into the rental market, many families lose their ability to accumulate wealth and work to exit poverty. Some of our viewers today may have heard of the term redlining. Well, to explain, redlining is when many people of minorities are segregated to certain neighborhoods due to their ability to obtain loans, compete with under-evaluation of housing, and inability to accumulate enough wealth to leave this area. The devaluation of homes in these areas has been proven to have a connection to social race and is a prominent factor when comparing areas of white lower class areas. According to Jared Richardson at the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, out of the 119 cities that researchers looked at, 117 of them showed that residents of majority Black neighborhoods endure a financial penalty for living there. People who live in these neighborhoods, which include about 5 million non-Black residents, along with 14.4 million African Americans, are unlikely to ever break away from the concentration poverty of their birthplace. Because these areas have been sequestered and kept from attaining any new accumulation, wealth, it can limit the resources of these individuals and result in a domino effect. Each community in these red line zones can lack sufficient health care, education, and other resources. In the case of education, another severe problem is being reflected. In 1954, the Supreme Court legally outlawed segregation in public schools, but that doesn't mean the effect was immediate. As of 2016, 62 years after legal segregation came into play in Cleveland, Mississippi, despite racial discrimination in schools being banned throughout the United States, injustice has continued unofficially. The high schools on opposite sides of an old railroad seem segregated. One high school is made up of about 95% Black students, while the other school on the opposite side of the tracks is very much white. While those in charge have been adamant about there not being problems with this, opportunities for minority students are limited. As has been illustrated here, the American dream that we will all have been taught to admire is not as concrete as many of us would like to believe. The world is gray, that is for sure. Now back to you at the front desk.
Wow. All these inequalities really put a damper on life. It's really disheartening.
I mean, only for the majority of the world's population. With all this social segregation and perpetuation of inequality, is there any hope for those in the lower classes, or are they doomed for good?
Well, Lizzie, the world may never know. It's a complex life we live, and I guess each of us will have to make the best of what we have. Maybe one day the rose-colored utopian will be a reality, but until then, all I can do is try and make the world a better place.